Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second in our 5-part webinar series on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, or CR2R for short. This webinar series systematically explores the elements of the corporate responsibility to respect as framed in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights to educate and support investors as they assess and engage with their portfolio companies on their human rights performance. Beyond investors, we hope that this series will be valuable to portfolio companies that need to disclose to investors their human rights commitments and performance, as well as civil society organizations and other stakeholders seeking to ensure that companies and investors meet their own human rights responsibilities. Early this year, we launched the series with the webinar on human rights policies and their implementation through effective governance. We are now beginning 3 webinars deconstructing human rights due diligence, beginning with this one, taking a deep dive into the first step of the due diligence process, namely human rights impact assessment. You'll find a dedicated webpage on the Investor Alliance website with links to the recordings of the webinars, slides, additional resources, and a link to our YouTube playlist with informative video logs from us with an overview, one from us with an overview of the human rights due diligence process, one from Kendall Salcido at Nomagaya, examining human rights due diligence red flags and hallmarks of effective assessment and due diligence, as well as a vlog from Eric Nyman at UNICEF, looking at integrating child rights into HRIA. Briefly, regarding logistical matters, as you'll have heard, we are recording this webinar. You are on mute, but during the Q&A, you will be able to pose questions by formulating questions in the Q&A box. Please do use the Q&A box rather than the chat function. We are pleased, Asaba, if you could advance to the next slide. We are pleased today to have 4 speakers. We have Talika Bensal, who is Senior Advisor at the Human Rights and Business Department at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. For the past 11 years, she has been co-leading the Danish Institute's work on human rights impact assessment, including co-authoring the Danish Institute's guidance and toolbox on HRIA. As a project manager and advisor to various corporate partnerships, she led and conducted over 15 HRIAs in countries in Asia, Eurasia, Latin America, and Africa across different industries such as food and agriculture, fast-moving consumer goods, and oil and gas sectors. Second, we're going to have Natalie Marichal, who is Policy Director and Partnership Manager at Ranking Digital Rights and an internationally recognized expert on digital rights, corporate governance, and corporate accountability. In 2020, Natalie was the lead author of RDR's It's the Business Model Report series, which builds on her 2018 Motherboard op-ed and argues that disinformation, hate speech, and other information harms linked to social media platforms are rooted in the surveillance capitalism business model. She has testified in front of the US House of Representatives and the US International Trade Commission. After that, we'll hear from Dunstan Allison Hope, who is the Vice President at Business for Social Responsibility and leads BSR's work at the intersection of technology and human rights. Dunstan has been with BSR for 18 years and previously led the organization's work on materiality, reporting, and disclosure. His recent work has included engagements with Google, Meta, Amazon, Salesforce, Snap, Microsoft, Verizon, Telenor, Telia, and Cisco, among others. Dunstan facilitated the multi-stakeholder process of developing global principles on freedom of expression and privacy, which led to the launch of the Global Network Initiative in October 2008. He has also facilitated the creation of the Responsible Business Alliance in 2004, which was formerly known as the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition. And then last but not least, we're going to hear from Jan Vis. He's the Global Lead for Social Impact in the Global Public Affairs and ESG Engagement Team at Nestle. He is in charge of a number of impact areas, including human rights, rural livelihoods, sustainable sourcing, youth, and just transition. He started his career at the Swiss Foreign Ministry before joining the team of the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, of course, Professor Ruggie. He joined Nestle in 2011 from the International Finance Corporation, where he participated in the development of the IOC performance standards and advised IOC clients on social and human rights issues across various sectors and geographies. Asaba, if you could advance to the agenda, please. Great, so as you can see here, this is our agenda for today. We are going to start off with, as I said, Talika. She's going to give us an overview of the steps in the impact assessment process, as well as discuss the relevance of human rights impact assessment for investors and highlight some hallmarks of robust impact assessment. Natalie is going to provide us an example of how a benchmark assesses corporate performance on impact assessment, and we'll be providing data from the RDR's most recent scorecard. Then we'll turn to a conversation with Dunstan and Jan, Dunstan will speak to us about impact assessment across the larger technology ecosystem and share with us learning from BSR's many human rights assessments with various technology companies. Then we'll switch gears a bit and look to impact assessment in supply chains. And there, Jan will share with us Nestle's experiences from multi-year partnership with the Danish Institute to conduct multiple assessments of its operations in various countries and how this has shaped Nestle's approach to due diligence. So we'll try our best to stay on time. So we have 10 minutes left for questions and discussions. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Talika. Talika, take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca, for the introduction, and hi, co-panelists and participants. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'll speak about what a human rights impact assessment is and what it aims to achieve. Then I'll also speak briefly about what human rights impact assessments mean in terms of investor communities, and I'll speak about how human rights impact assessments fit within the human rights due diligence framework. And then I'll briefly go through the steps of an HRA and some of the key elements of a good practice HRA. And then I have a couple of slides that you can have a look at later on because I won't have enough time to go through them. So next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so what is a human rights impact assessment? I think most of you are familiar with what they are, but for those of you for whom this is a relatively new concept, a human rights impact assessment is a specific process to identify, understand, assess, and address the adverse impacts of a business project or activity or operation on the human rights enjoyment of impacted rights holders. So it's not a process that looks at the risks or impacts to the business, but really the impacts to people, which can be workers, community members, or consumers. And it's also about adverse impacts. So it doesn't necessarily look at the positive impacts. The second element is that it's an elaborate assessment process. So it's not a desktop exercise. It's an exercise that is conducted through field work and interviews with rights holders, company representatives, and other stakeholders, and can take from a couple of months to half a year or even longer. The third element is that it's a standalone exercise, but the follow-up is iterative. So it's something that you do in an ongoing manner. So while the human rights impact assessment is, let's say, a process of 3 weeks on the ground, your activities that follow after that should be ongoing and can, for example, include going back to the country where you conducted the impact assessment after, let's say, 2 years to see how the situation has changed on the ground. And the last element is that human rights impact assessments are on human rights, through human rights, and for human rights. And what do we mean with that? This means that the topic of the human rights impact assessment is international human rights. So which human rights are impacted, which is different to, for example, an environmental impact assessment or a social impact assessment where the topic is environment or social issues. Then the impact assessment is done through human rights. So through a human rights-based approach, applying human rights principles such as participation, non-discrimination, transparency, etc. And lastly, there are for human rights. So human rights impact assessment is really a tool to promote the human rights and respect the human rights of those that are affected. Next slide, please. So what does a human rights impact assessment aim to do? So it aims to do a number of things. For example, it aims to identify, avoid, and address adverse human rights impacts and to achieve change for those people on the ground that are affected, what we call rights holders. Then it can also be a tool to establish meaningful dialogue between stakeholders, for example, between a company and a CSO, a company and communities, or a company and trade union. And thirdly, it can be a tool to facilitate capacity building and learning of different types of stakeholders. So this could be learning on human rights for company staff, but also rights holders to assert their rights. Then a next element of a human rights impact assessment is enhancing transparency and accountability of businesses by documenting their impacts and publishing these. So this is only relevant in the case where companies actually publish their human rights impact assessment reports. And the last important achievement of a human rights impact assessment is that it could empower rights holders to hold businesses accountable for adverse human rights impacts. So those that have been involved in the impact assessment can actually afterwards go back to the company and say, what have you done with regard to the findings of the impact assessment? Next slide, please. So what is the relevance of a human rights impact assessment to the investor community? Firstly, a human rights impact assessment can provide investors with a detailed human rights lens to ESG issues associated with a specific investment or a type of investment. Secondly, an HRA that is conducted in a certain context can serve as a potential tool to prevent or mitigate human rights impacts in a certain high-risk context. So for example, a conflict related context, post-conflict, or in the current situation of the COVID-19 impacts. Also, human rights impact assessment reports can provide valuable information to investors during the pre-investment stage. And lastly, piloting HRAs across select investments can result in learnings applicable to the wider ESG system. Lastly, civil society and consumers can also push and demand investors to take action on human rights issues regarding a certain investment project. And an HRA can be a means to show to this community, civil society community, that are taking on the issue of human rights. Next slide, please. So very briefly, where human rights impact assessment sits within the wider human rights due diligence cycle. So human rights impact assessment is a part of human rights due diligence. And the UNGPs don't specifically speak or mention human rights impact assessment, but they say assessment of human rights impacts. And this can be done in different ways. So one method is a dedicated human rights impact assessment commissioned by a company, but it could also be the integration of human rights in other types of assessments and studies, such as environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment, ESHAs, and other types of ESG activities and tools. Next slide, please. So very briefly about the different steps of a human rights impact assessment. An impact assessment consists of 5 steps or 5 phases and 1 cross-cutting element. Step 1 is the planning and scoping phase. This is where the company, together with a third-party organization who is conducting the HRA, decides on the terms of reference of the HRA, sets up a team, and decides on the where, which country, which region, which issues, which topics, which products, commodities, etc. The assessment will focus on. In this phase, it's where we conduct desktop research and develop questionnaires and conduct some preliminary interviews to set the scope. The second phase is the field-based phase, where data is collected in the field through interviews with rights holders, company representatives, other duty bearers, and other stakeholders using different human rights indicators. The third phase is the analyzing impacts phase. So upon return from the field, the data is analyzed, and we look at which rights are impacted, which types of impacts exist, and we assess the severity of the different human rights impacts. In phase 4, we develop recommendations or actions to address the impacts that we have found in the field, as well as a plan to monitor these impacts. In this step, we also look at how to remedy adverse impacts. And the last phase is the step where we look at publishing the report of the human rights impact assessment. This is important because this leads to more accountability vis-a-vis rights holders. And in this phase, we also think about how to report back to rights holders who have participated in the assessment, as well as to other stakeholders. And in this final phase, we also look to evaluate the human rights impact assessment process. And then one cross-cutting element is stakeholder engagement. This is where the team has to ensure that throughout the impact assessment, relevant stakeholders, including rights holders, are engaged, and that this is done in a human rights compatible manner. Next slide, please. So I won't be able to go through all these elements of what a good human rights impact assessment should look like, looking at these criteria. So I'll just pick a few. For example, the basis of an HRA should be participation of rights holders, duty bearers, and other stakeholders. And this should be done in a non-discriminatory participatory manner. So it should be accessible to communities and done in, for example, a language that is inclusive and take into consideration elements such as gender. Another very important element of a good practice HRA is transparency. So during and after the HRA, transparency and information sharing with stakeholders and rights holders is absolutely key. And this should be done both during the process, but also to be transparent around outcomes. Then in terms of the content of the HRA, the human rights impact assessment should be built on international human rights standards. So it should cover all rights and different types of impacts. So it should look at the impacts that the company causes, but also is contributing to or is linked to, and should also consider cumulative impacts. And lastly, it is important to take into consideration access to remedy. So those that participate in the human rights impact assessment should have an avenue to raise complaints regarding an HRA during and after the assessment. And this could, for example, be important in the case of retaliation of those that have participated in a human rights impact assessment in a context where human rights can be a sensitive topic. I'll conclude with a last slide, which is a slide with a number of examples of HRAs that the Danish Institute has been involved in or we have been made aware of. So as you can see here, we have a number of human rights impact assessments that look at different sectors, food and beverage, oil and gas, but also some technology, but also some impact assessments that have looked not at one business, but at a sector as a whole. So here you can see the example of the salmon industry in Chile and the mining industry in Colombia. And these are also good examples for investors because they can provide the investor community with an overview of the human rights impacts of the whole sector rather than one company, and can be interesting in the pre-investment stage. The very last slide that I have is a list of resources that I'll ask you to look at your own ease because we're running out of time. Thank you for listening and looking forward to the Q&A later on.
Thank you, Talika. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. Really appreciate that. And as Talika mentioned, these slides will be made available. I also encourage you to go to the event webpage where we do have a recording of a longer webinar, 45 minutes dedicated to this topic, which features Talika as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over then to Natalie to take us to an example of a benchmark of corporate performance on impact assessments. Natalie, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. My name is Natalie Marichal. I'm the Policy Director at Ranking Digital Rights, or RDR. And today I'm going to talk about how we evaluate the human rights due diligence performance of the companies that we assess. For those of you who may not be familiar with RDR, we publish the Corporate Accountability Index and the related scorecards. The latest one was the Big Tech Scorecard that we published just a couple weeks ago, and it assesses 14 different global digital platforms on their respect for human rights, with a particular emphasis on privacy and on freedom of expression and information. Next slide. As Talika just covered, human rights impact assessment is a process for systematically identifying, predicting, and responding to the potential human rights impacts of a business operation. This is particularly important in the big tech and telecom sector because the telecommunications and tech companies are operating at an unprecedented scale. This is especially the case for big tech platforms, and this creates all kinds of new opportunities for harm. We know that regulation of these harms and of these companies' business operations in particular is woefully inadequate, especially in the context of the Silicon Valley risk-taking, move fast and break things kind of mentality. And we know as well that marginalized groups are often hurt the worst by big tech missteps. So it's really important to have a methodical way of thinking through the worst case scenarios for a company's products rather than just barreling into a new market or creating a new market with rosy ideas of how tech is going to change the world. Now, of course, HRIAs are not the only kind of due diligence that companies should perform. For example, they need to also carefully review each and every request from law enforcement to share user information or to restrict user content. Those are things that we evaluate as part of our benchmarking process as well. But today I'm going to really focus on our indicators related to HRIAs. Next slide. So when it comes to HRAs, we look, again, our focus is on companies in the big tech and telecom sectors. So we look for companies to evaluate first the impact of laws in each jurisdiction in which they operate on privacy and freedom of expression. Two, the impact of their own policy enforcement processes. And I speak of policy enforcement as distinct to policy. We know that, especially when it comes to content moderation, companies have policies, but the enforcement sometimes is lacking. So it's important that they evaluate not just whether their policies are good, but whether their processes for enforcing the policies are actually good as well. More recently, we added indicators related to doing impact assessments around targeted advertising and the use of algorithmic systems in a company's business operations. And for companies to which this is relevant, we also look for an HRIA related to zero rating. So in the context of the companies we look at, that would mean all of the telecom operators plus Facebook, looking specifically at the free basics zero rating partnerships that the company, I should say Meta rather than Facebook, old habits die hard, the partnerships that this company has with telecom operators around the world. Next slide. So from our perspective, there are a few things that HRAs should do, and these are specific things that we look for for our scorecards. First, they need to consider privacy, freedom of expression, and other human rights. That needs to be explicit. They should be performed before launching or acquiring a new service, and before entering new markets. And that could be a geographic market, but it could also be a different demographic, such as, for example, if and when Meta moves forward with its Instagram for Kids plan, we would expect them to disclose a thorough HRIA prior to entering this new demographic market. And they should also be completed on a regular schedule, examining all operations, including for existing product and service lines. The assessments should be reviewed by executives and board members, be assured by an accredited third party, and the company should publicly commit to keep doing them. And the publicly committing part is really key here. As with all of our indicators, we based our evaluation on companies' public disclosures and commitments about this. Now, it doesn't mean that we expect companies to disclose the full scope of their human rights impact assessment. That's not really possible. In many cases, it would be counterproductive or jeopardize the safety of the rights holders who were involved and engaged in the human rights impact assessment process. But what we are looking for is for a company to clearly disclose its overall process for doing HRIAs, the topics on which they conduct them, the frequency, basically all the elements that I just talked about here. And I really want to emphasize the importance of doing them proactively. They are too often retroactive, which is, I suppose, better than nothing, but is really, too little, too late in many cases. Next slide. So unfortunately, I don't have time today to go through the specific results for each of the companies in our big tech scorecard, but you can find all that information there. You have the URL, and that's the list of the companies that we evaluated in the big tech scorecard this year. In the fall, we will be publishing the Telco Giant scorecard, which will have similar data for 12 different telecom operators headquartered around the world. Next slide. So I want to highlight just a few of our findings at the aggregate level. This is the HRIA related indicator that companies tend to do best on. And as you can see, there's a cluster of top performers, a couple middling performances, and then it goes downhill really, really quickly. I also want to call out that Amazon is the only US-based company not to disclose anything about its any HRA process it may or may not have related to governments and regulations, and their impact on freedom of expression and information and privacy. Next slide. So this is looking at all four areas here. As you can see, the average score for the impact assessment on laws and regulations, the one that we just looked at, is 34% of the points possible. Policy enforcement 10, targeted ads 2. Basically, Meta is the only company to disclose anything about that, and that is due to some limited impact assessments that they did as part of the civil rights audit that they agreed to do as part of a settlement of a lawsuit. So, it's something that was done under duress, that's only limited to the US market, and that is really limited in scope even within the US market. So it's really not something to rest. This is not an opportunity for Meta to rest on its laurels, but they are the only company in our scorecard that has done anything on this. And then AI or algorithmic systems is not much better. There's very little HRAs being done, or at least being talked about publicly here. Next slide. So to wrap up, just a few key insights here that stood out to us. Yahoo led on its disclosure of HRAs, despite an overall decline from the previous year in its overall score. Again, Amazon was the worst among the US companies, didn't disclose anything related to due diligence. Likewise, Chinese and Russian companies score 0% or something close to it. Apple improved a bit on its disclosures about HRIAs related to governments and regulations. And again, Yahoo improved on its policy enforcement HRIA. The best score ever was on Telefonica. Telefonica had a very high score in our 2020 index. And some weak points across the board here are that companies do not make any kind of commitments that the executive leadership or the board of directors actually reviews the HRIAs, much less takes them into account in making decisions. And we're not really seeing any companies commit to doing follow-up HRIAs when the initial process identified concerns. I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Dunstan and Jan. I'm very happy to chat more about this at the end of our session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. And I know there's a lot more information to be unpacked that's in that scorecard, and hopefully we can get to some of that in the Q&A. And I also very much encourage people to take a look at that scorecard. So thank you. So I'm going to ask Dunstan to come on camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Wonderful. So I thought we'd kind of start off our conversation here. We'll do this more in the form of a kind of an interview type session. And I know you have some slides that you want to share as well. So perhaps when we get to that point in the questions, you can direct Asaba which slide she should go to. But I want to start off, Dunstan. We had mentioned at the outset you have done engagements with a number of tech companies, including conducting over 100 human rights assessments. And in a recent submission of BSR to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights regarding the practical application of the guiding principles to the activities of tech companies, BSR cautioned against a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to due diligence, especially given the complexity of the technology ecosystem. And in fact, your engagements with companies have taken many forms across the tech ecosystem based on geography, products, customers, and governance. And I was wondering if you could take a moment to sketch out the tech ecosystem for us and explain why a tailored approach to human rights assessment as part of the due diligence process is important.
Great. Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to the Investor Alliance for the invitation to participate. So if you go to the next slide. So I do want to start by noting that human rights assessments, as you say, do come in different shapes and sizes. And this slide attempts to summarize our experience. So as you can see, we've undertaken assessments that are focused on products, on geographies, on customers, and on different elements of governance. But even within those categories, assessments can vary quite a lot. So a product assessment might be of an entire social media platform. It might be just of a new feature. A customer assessment might be of an entire industry vertical, or it may be of a single customer relationship that the company is thinking of entering into. Some assessments, as Talika mentioned, may take a long time. They may take years. Other assessments may have a very strict near-term deadline, like a particular sale or a merger and acquisition that's going to happen. There are some important common elements, of course, reviewing impacts against all potentially relevant human rights, paying particular attention to the needs and interests of vulnerable groups. But the intention of this slide is to convey the notion that they do come in many different shapes and sizes. And if you go to the next slide, I'll just address the ecosystem point briefly. So it has been striking to us that while we frequently and typically undertake human rights assessments for a single company, they do exist in the context of this much broader, very complex technology ecosystem. And that decisions that might be made by one company in one part of the ecosystem might have human rights impacts elsewhere in the technology ecosystem. Many human rights challenges are system-wide and require system-wide approaches, not just specific actions by specific companies. So, a lot of our thinking and work and practical experience on human rights assessments has come from working with individual companies. But the more that we do these things, the more that we realize that a more system-wide approach is needed. And I'm not going to describe all the different boxes on this slide, but hopefully you can see the point here, which is that there are lots of different players across the ecosystem, and decisions in one part may have impacts elsewhere. We're actually currently engaged in a project with the Global Network Initiative to develop a map of this ecosystem. And what I'm sharing here is a sneak peek of what we're doing. And we want to be able to define how more joined up approaches to human rights assessment can be undertaken. So for example, how might a network equipment manufacturer undertake a human rights assessment jointly with a telecoms operator or jointly with a social media company to understand shared impacts and shared interests in a particular market or the particular industry vertical. But with that, back to you, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks. And this is a really helpful diagram, and certainly, evidences the kind of complexity we're talking about. But you had talked about the fact that there are often problems that are system-wide, and I think one root cause of the human rights challenges this industry faces is within its business model, built on surveillance-based targeted advertising. So I'm wondering, how can impact assessments to include these types of joined-up impact assessments and accompany due diligence processes uncover and address some of these challenges associated with this industry-wide business model?
It's a good question. And I want to be honest by saying I think we're at the very early stages of our thinking on that question. And I do want to thank Natalie and the team at Ranking Digital Rights for posing this question and putting it out there. Excuse me, one reflection that I think we have is that it would be important to think in terms of business models plural rather than the business model singular. So thinking in terms of business models plural rather than the business model singular. And we're often already considering business model relevant factors in human rights assessment. So things like what customers shouldn't we sell to? What product features shouldn't we bring into a particular market? What impact might this product have elsewhere in the ecosystem that might suggest that we shouldn't deploy this product in the first place? However, I think a lot of work needs to be done to take a more deliberate approach to thinking about business models. And one thing that does come to mind to me is something that Talika mentioned, which is the opportunity to combine forces with other assessments and processes that companies also have in place. So the requirement for a data protection impact assessment as part of the GDPR, for example, how can we better embed a human rights-based approach into those assessments? We have the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act coming in the European Union. How can we make sure that human rights-based approaches are better embedded into actions that will result from those two directives? So I think this is a work in progress. I think we're going to bump up against challenges, which I know we'll come to in this conversation, around how to deal with both human rights risks and opportunities at the same time.
Yeah, thank
Back to
you.
you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I want to, while we've taken the system-wide approach, I do want to take a moment to focus in on a recent assessment that you've completed for Meta with regards to extending its end-to-end encryption across its messaging services. And one of the things I think that came up in that assessment are some of the dilemmas, human rights dilemmas that companies may have to face. In this case, for example, regarding the relationship between privacy and security. And I'm wondering, can you elaborate a bit on those dilemmas, what they raise both for users, but also non-users of Meta services? And just was curious as to maybe if you could give us some insights as to what you advise the company and how to address those dilemmas.
Yes, thank you. So I have 2 quick slides to share, but I would encourage people to read either the 120-page full assessment or the 20-page executive summary, both of which have been published by Meta alongside their response to our assessment. So in the assessment, we identified the human rights opportunities associated with end-to-end encryption, which are on the left-hand side there. But we found it was important to note that those should be framed not just as opportunities, but actually things that address the adverse human rights impacts that are associated with the absence of end-to-end encryption. So these are human rights opportunities of end-to-end encryption, but they are also actually things where end-to-end encryption helps address the adverse impacts associated with the absence of end-to-end encryption. But then we also identified the human rights risks associated with end-to-end encryption and made recommendations for how they can be addressed. And some of those risks are on the right-hand side of the slide there. And this is an example of a human rights assessment being done before a particular, in this case, I guess, new product functionality is and feature is brought to market. But if you go to the next slide, as you noted, human rights can sometimes be in tension with each other, and we need to figure out a human rights-based way to address that. And it does get quite complex. So here I'm going to take the liberty of essentially reading directly from the assessment. So in the assessment, we say that human rights can be in tension with one another for legitimate reasons, and rights-based methods can be deployed to define a path forward when 2 competing rights cannot both be achieved in their entirety. And we conclude that rather than offsetting one right against another, it is important to pursue the fullest expression of both rights and identify how potential harms can be addressed. And in the assessment, we look at the tension between the right to privacy and the right to security, for example. We look at the tension between the right to privacy and child rights. But we note that the reality is much more nuanced than just one right being in conflict with another right. And we try to set out a much more nuanced based approach to understanding how to realize the fullest possible expression of all rights. And to do so, we use the criteria that are shown on this slide. Things like legitimacy, is there a legitimate aim in any restrictions to a right? Necessity and proportionality, is the restriction to the right necessary, or can the legitimate goal be achieved through other means? If it is necessary, is it the least intrusive way to restrict this right? And non-discrimination, can the restriction to this right be done in a non-discriminatory manner? So the full assessment that I mentioned, the 120-page assessment, has a lot of analysis on how these principles and methods would apply in the context of deploying end-to-end encryption to, in this case, Facebook Messenger and Instagram Direct. And with that, I'll stop and
this is great, because I know certainly not just the tech industry, but others are having to face these types of human rights dilemmas. So I find these kind of principle-based questions really useful. One last quick question, because I want to leave time for Jan and also a Q&A. Just very briefly, investors obviously need tech companies to disclose information about their human rights assessment due diligence processes in order to address their own potential risk exposure. So 2 questions for you. I hope you can answer them in a minute or so. But what reasonable expectations can investors have in terms of disclosures of impact assessments? And then second, what maybe 2 or 3 things should investors look for in a good practice human rights assessment?
Mm-hmm. So I think what investors should expect should be quite simple, which is described in Principle 21 of the UNGPs. Companies should disclose sufficient information about their approach for it to be effectively evaluated. That's what investors should expect. But the reality today is that there isn't really a standard or a best practice, and current approaches by companies are all over the place. And I think we need much more clearly defined best practices and approaches. I think what I would like to see, to answer your question directly, is first of all, annual reports from companies. The second of all, describe the results of human rights assessments. And third, describe the actions that they are taking alone or with others to address those human rights impacts. So my starting point is this notion of an annual disclosure cycle, and that's where the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the European Union, for example, is headed. The Due Diligence Directive is headed in that direction. That said, there may be times where companies choose to publish full human rights assessments or executive summaries of them, especially when the topic of the assessment is of great interest to the field and will provide insights that are helpful to other companies. And I think the end-to-end encryption example is a good one there, in the sense that it's unique to Meta, but it actually raises issues around end-to-end encryption that will be relevant to many other companies as well. So there may be times where companies choose to publish the entire assessment.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you, Dunstan. Okay, so I'm going to ask Jan to come on camera, and just maybe we can put the slides to the side for a moment. Excellent. And Dunstan apparently now looks like yeast extract. Yeah, and welcome into the conversation here. I want to switch gears a bit, and I want to talk a little bit about Nestlé's multi-year collaboration with the Danish Institute to conduct a series of 7 human rights impact assessments of various company operations. And to my knowledge, no other global corporation has undertaken an effort of that scale. Can you maybe explain to us Nestlé's reason for launching the partnership and what Nestlé hoped to achieve through it?
Yes, of course. It's actually a bit more than 7. It's 13 in total, actually.
Oh my, okay, much more than
it's
I thought.
even more than that. But no, look, so we started working with the Danish Institute for Human Rights back in 2008. And it was really like well before actually the UNGPs were adopted by the UN Human Rights Council. And the way it started, I was not with the company back then, but I was with the World Bank, with IFC, but we started actually the exact same way. So it's interesting to tell the story. Desktop analysis, really. So actually for Nestlé or for IFC to understand whether there were gaps in their policies or mechanisms in terms of like human rights. So really like what was very valuable with the Danish Institute at the time is that they were the only organization out there with a set of indicators that would really like help companies or organizations understand what human rights mean in practice. So what is it that we need to look at? So we did that. There were a number of gaps on both organizations, but then actually the need to really like go on the ground and see by ourselves, you know, like what is it that we are talking about came up, and this is really like when we started doing human rights impact assessment. It started in 2009 in Colombia until 2017 in Indonesia, and there are actually like 17 human rights impact assessments that we carried out together. So really the need actually to see it and really also to cover, I would say, the entire spectrum of activities in a single country. And I think this is really like what is very unique with human rights impact assessment, at least the way that we have done them, because I understand that there are different ways of doing them or to scope them down, actually to focus on one product or one activity. I think our need was actually to cover what we called high-risk countries and see actually where the risks were. Is it more like in our operations, our distribution activities, or marketing practices? Is it more like in our factories, or more the way that we interact with suppliers? Is it more like in the upstream supply chain, the way that we buy raw materials? So there was really this willingness from both organizations, so both Nestlé and the Danish Institute for Human Rights, to cover as much as we could. And of course, it's impossible because Nestlé is big, like even if you focus in one single country. So we had this country assessments that actually like help us assess the risks and where we actually should go, which areas of our business or which regions of the country we should cover first to have a better sense of like what's going on. I've said it and I'll say it again, that that's the most valuable thing that we have done, I think, as part of our human rights due diligence program. I mean, not only because they have helped us address issues on the ground, so where we conducted the assessments themselves, but they have also, I mean, the results of these assessments have really helped us improve our corporate policies, our mechanisms, control mechanisms, our audit protocols, the way that we train our colleagues. So we really try to factor these findings in the corporate program that we have in place. If we had to do it again, I think we would do it the same way. So really go on the ground and interact with people, ask the relevant questions, cover the high risk areas. Beyond just the results, there is also the process that is important. And from an internal perspective, so from a company perspective, this is, I think, the best way to really raise awareness of our colleagues, especially the ones that are not based in the US or in Europe, where actually the UNGPs or any discussion about business and human rights is not actually that prevalent as where we are based, actually. And that's very important because it's not, it's really a very tangible and concrete way to engage a discussion, because it's based on a reality that our colleagues know, right? Their business environments, and actually trying to plug the UNGPs or the human rights framework on situations that they know well. So it makes actually this discussion very tangible, very concrete for them as well. And it's been great from that perspective too.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to know, and quite a journey it sounds like. And you talked about the fact that the going through this process 17 times over has really shaped the way Nestle conducts its human rights due diligence program. I'm wondering, and you gave us some indications of what that looked like. Can you maybe deep dive maybe 2 examples of how particularly your due diligence program was influenced by the outcomes of those impact assessments? And then relatedly, if I were to ask you maybe to provide 2 or 3 key lessons or takeaways from that process that you might want to share with other companies in the food and beverage sector, what would those be? You indicated, for example, about the fact that this helped to raise awareness in the various country operations, but maybe diving a little deep on those 2 questions for us.
Yeah, so it has helped us in many different ways. Maybe first and foremost, in our capacity to identify our salient human rights issues. And I'm not saying here that these human rights impact assessments have been the sole source of information that we have used actually to identify our 10 salient human rights issues, but they have played a very important role. So these findings have really helped us understand what is it that we should focus on. And this is partly why we decided back in 2017 actually to stop doing these human rights impact assessments, because after having done 13 of them and covered the most high-risk countries, we thought, and maybe Tulika will want to add to that, but we thought that we had reached a certain level of maturity, because the same kind of findings were coming back again, and I guess it's for a good reason, because we were trying to really cover a lot of ground in terms of business activities in a specific region. I think this human rights impact assessment kept quite general in terms of covering the issues, yes, but maybe not actually having the time or the resources to really go in depth. And this is really where we wanted to go at Nestle back in 2017. So really focusing on these 10 salient issues, and really actually go deep into these issues wherever they occur. And for us, it basically means worldwide. So for example, on child labor, really going into the raw material supply chains and actually engage the different suppliers. We have to engage back to the farmer and really see what we can do to change that. So as I said, they have been a great tool for us to inform where the potential or actual impacts are for us as a company. They have helped us really improve the situation on the ground through dedicated action plans and to raise awareness of our colleagues. They have also like helped us as a company to better understand where is it that we should focus on. And now actually as part of our new human rights framework and roadmap, and using this list of salient issues, we are working with more specialized organizations that can really like advise us on specific issues like, you know, the International Cocoa Initiative on child labor, or Verite on forced labor, or the Fair Labor Association on working conditions. So we like trying to work with specialized organizations and do deep dives where the risks are really like super high. For any company that reaches out to me and ask me like how they should get started, I mean, I always advise them to do like a human rights impact assessment, not only because it's an interesting methodology to go through, but because it's a great exposure for any human rights practitioner actually to go through and learn from it.
No, that's really great to hear, Jan. And it sounds like I was going to ask you if there's maybe 2 or 3 outstanding challenges that you feel you're facing. But it sounds like you're already getting at that, and the fact that you really have found you need a deep dive on some of these salient issues. So, you know, if you want to add anything on that front, please do. But perhaps I can jump to the final question I wanted to ask you, similar to the one that I had asked Dunstan, and that is in terms of if you were to put yourself in investors' shoes, what would you advise them to look for in terms of HRA good practice, in particular, to be assured that a company is on the right path? This is obviously a journey, and investors are looking for companies that are on that journey, not expecting necessarily companies to, you know, get it completely right the first time around. And equivalently, are there any red flags that would alert investors that maybe, you know, not all is good, that companies aren't taking the necessary steps that they need to?
So I'll respond to this question, and then I can go back to some of the challenges that we face, because I think they are related. But I think there is just way too much emphasis on due diligence, and this is very much process oriented. And I think this is good, but like all the benchmarks or ratings that, you know, we know, and some of them are more generic, others are sector specific, but they miss the point. They really do, because basically it's way too easy actually for a company to have a human rights policy in place or to set up a training program. I think what I'm missing in all the investor calls that I participate in is the discussion on impact, and how actually like what we do as company actually like has an impact on some of the salient issues we face, or some of the challenges that, you know, we encounter in the countries where we operate. And this is a bit unfortunate, and I think this is one of the unintended consequences of this mandatory human rights due diligence legislations. We are been supporting them actively, because they do create the level playing field that we need, including, you know, for smaller companies, and a lot of them are in our supply chain, so this is good. But when it comes to if an investor is truly interested in what a company does, and then really like try to assess whether what they do is tangible, I think they should really try to go and move beyond just this, I would say, like process-oriented questions that, you know, we too often see like in surveys or questionnaires we have to fill in, and really like move into the impact area. And this is really like what we have tried to do at Nestle, really like building, and of course it's a journey, so I'm not saying that, you know, companies should jump in impact areas straight away, because it does take time. But I think, you know, we started with purely like compliance certification schemes, Rainforest Alliance, fair trades, you know, like trying to see like whether there was like any good things there from a due diligence perspective. And yes, there is, but there are a lot of gaps as well. So we know, for example, that for child labor, these certification schemes just don't help much actually, because all the child labor instances that we have covered on cocoa farms are from certified farms. And then we moved on and tried to set up this child labor monitoring system that is, I think, the most advanced due diligence program we have in place. But still, after 10 years, you know, we have to realize that even though we have been able to remediate 150,000 cases of child labor risk in the supply chain, no, there's still a risk, and the challenge remains. So we're trying really like to move the needle and actually like address, I think what is one of the root causes of child labor, which is really like farmers' income, investing quite a lot of money in that. And I think that's a good illustration of what a human rights journey for a company like ours that really like face human rights issues in the upstream supply chain can be. Really like trying to move beyond due diligence, because due diligence remains a process. And so when it comes to addressing some of the systemic issues that we are faced with as an ag company, something else is needed. So that's my hope actually for the next years, that, you know, like we can have these discussions as well with investors, that we can move from the traditional questions, so do you have a human rights policy or do you train your employees, to, okay, but how do you report on impacts? What are the challenges you face when you try to improve the farmers' livelihoods? Who do you work with? And what are the levers that you use to do that?
Oh, thank you, Jan. And that's certainly, I think, something that all of us are struggling with in terms of how to be less focused on process and be more focused on impacts and outcomes. I'm going to ask all the speakers to come back. We only have, unfortunately, 4 minutes left. I'm trying to skim the questions here quickly that are coming in. I'm going to start with one from Pat Zarega, because I know this comes up often in our discussion. And maybe directed at Talika. Basically, what should investors, when they encourage companies to do impact assessments, companies often ask, well, you know, there's a lot of people doing impact assessments out there. How do I know if someone is going to do a good impact assessment? Talika, is that maybe something you could briefly speak to?
Yes, I can very briefly highlight that I think companies should have conversations with potential consultants and ask them about the methodology. And I think it's key, for example, that they ask around the criteria that are applied to do a human rights impact assessment. In one of the slides, I pointed out these 10 key criteria for a human rights impact assessment. So, for example, if the human rights impact assessment is published at the end, if there is a commitment to include all rights holders, that it's not a desktop exercise, that the people who do the impact assessment have a human rights background, that you develop a team that is multidisciplinary, that you have the right skill set. So I'm not going to name any specific companies, organizations, but I think it's really important to look at the expertise and experience of organizations and that they have done human rights impact assessment, that have been published, that there is a track record of doing them a lot. There's a lot of organizations that offer hundreds of different services. You may want to consider that that organization maybe is not specialized in human rights impact assessment. So that's maybe what I can share. I'm sure Dunstan also has something to share on this.
Feel free to jump in on that.
I was just going to say we need way more organizations qualified to do this. And I would also emphasize the importance of building the capacity capability inside companies to do this themselves. And that is one of the desired outcomes of an assessment, is actually building the capability and competency inside a company to do this themselves. And as Jan mentioned, then getting to impact and being able to embed that culture into the company.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to another question, this one from Vaidi. I think this is maybe directed towards Jan and Dunstan. You know, oftentimes companies will point to an HRI they've done, and Vaidi's curious, when and why should companies decide to revisit our HRA? Do you have some examples of companies do that? Because companies oftentimes will say they've done one, they spend a lot of time then preparing, you know, a strategy to address the type of risk they've identified. So what should trigger a kind of revisitation of an impact assessment? I'll say Dunstan, then Jan perhaps can answer that.
Yeah, I also put an answer in the chat, so apologies for just repeating that. But
no, please, just I missed that.
I tried to think through, try to identify examples of companies that have revisited a human rights assessment thoroughly. In other words, doing a second assessment. Couldn't think of a single example. And I think we're trying to emphasize companies moving from these sort of single moment in time human rights assessments into ongoing human rights due diligence, and what does that look like over time, so that you can get to impacts more quickly, but also because circumstances change, and we see this a lot in conflict affected areas where, you know, a moment in time assessment can pretty quickly be too late or be too unresponsive to facts on the ground, and so we're seeing a move towards more ongoing due diligence. rather than these sort of big single moment in time assessments.
Thanks, Jan. Do you want to add?
No, Dunstan said it really. I mean, that's exactly spot on. Actually, there is, at least not for us, it's never been what we wanted to do, because we used HRIAs as a baseline, so to understand what's going on. But then the ongoing parts is really like done through other means. You know, we have like other control mechanisms, audit systems, grievance mechanisms that, you know, we have tried to leverage actually to do that work. And that's really the purpose of having a human rights framework or program in place. So human rights impact assessment should not be seen as a way to just deliver on due diligence. I think they are missing the point if companies think this can done the work.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time. Unfortunately, there were quite a few additional questions that were in the chat function, the question and answer box. And I see, thank you, some of you already took the initiative to answer some of those questions. Please do feel free for any questions we did not answer to follow up with us. Feel free to send the questions my way, and I will gladly pose them to the speakers and provide any type of response that they're able to give. Thank you to all of our speakers for taking the time today to be with us. I think we raised some really important issues today. Of course, this is a big topic and we could go on much longer, but we will be posting the recording of this webinar along with the slides and additional resources to the event webpage. And we encourage you to join us for the next 3 sessions. We've got coming up the next 2, unpacking further the due diligence process, and then the final session focusing in on grievance mechanisms and effective stakeholder engagement. So thank you to all of you, and have a good rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.